Welcome to the Free Library. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I am pleased to have our guest here this evening. In this time of division and bitterness, when the social fabric is rent in so many different directions, it's a pleasure to pull up a seat at King Solomon's table with our guest and guide, Joan Nathan, as she takes us on an around-the-world tour of the diasporic fantasia that is Jewish cooking today, by which, of course, I mean the last 3,000 years. What's the Simis? I'm glad you asked. Please welcome Joan Nathan.
Thank you, Andy. It's really nice to be here. I was here I think with Jewish Cooking in America, and I loved being at the Free Library, so I'm very happy to be back. I'll talk to you for about a half an hour, and then you can ask whatever question you want. And then, of course, I'll sign books. And I think there's going to be a dinner also at Abe Fisher the day after I'm at the museum. So if any of you want a dinner for my book, sign up for that. Okay, so people ask me, why? Oh, you were at Vetrie's. Why King Solomon's Table? And this is not the book I set out to write. I was going to write a book for my kids' generation on sort of new American cooking, and then I realized, wait a second, I'm not sure this is what I want to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So we went as a family to Kochi in India, and we went to the synagogue there, and I looked, there was a sign on the wall that said that Jews had been there since the time of King Solomon. So I started getting interested in King Solomon. And, I thought, oh. So then I talked to some archaeologists to see if King Solomon existed. There's a whole school that says he did. Then there's a whole school that says he's just a myth and that the myth is again and again and he never existed. But the archaeologists say that he did existed. I agree with them because, first of all, I want to, but secondly, because this archaeologist found evidence of King David. If they found evidence of King David, they'll find Solomon. So, and then I thought, well, why didn't I start with David? But David was a warrior, and also my friend Geraldine Brooks was writing a book on King David, so I thought she was helping me on the biblical period. We were comparing books that we were reading, and I thought, no, that's King Solomon. It's a great name. He's wise, and he liked lots of women, so he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which was all a sign of power in those days. And he set out for the wide reaches of the Jewish world, which reached as far as India in those days, which meant that there were boats, the day boats, D-E-O-G-H, boats that were learned by the Jews from the Phoenicians that would set out from Aden or from Yemen. They'd go down by land to Yemen, and then they would go in the Arabian Sea by the winds and then to the Indian Ocean and to little estuaries where they would dock, and they'd find ginger and cardamom and precious stones and peacocks, and it's all in the Book of Kings. And then when I went to India, I looked, there was a synagogue from the 12th century and a little village with a synagogue, a church, a mosque, and a Hindu, not church, but anyway, Hindu shrine. What? Temple, right, Hindu temple. So I realized that if it was from the 12th century, it might have been earlier, and we don't know. And there was a man who was a big specialist on Indian Jewry, the history of Indian Jewry, and he said to me, Joan, there's no evidence, but I knew from writing my book on the food of the Jews of France that there was no evidence of the 150 or so villages in the south of France that had Jews living there that were peddlers, and that they were from the first and second centuries. So, what would be that's left would be if there was a stone for a cemetery stone, or maybe then an indentation for a mezuzah, but, it's a long time, 2,000 years, and there aren't that many vestiges of life. Anyway, so that made me think about King Solomon. But then I thought, I went to an archaeological conference, and I talked to all these archaeologists that were dealing with early foods, and they all said to look at this one book by, what's his name, Jean, I don't know, his name was Jean somebody. But anyway, this book was about Babylonian food in the year I'll remember it, 1700 BC. And the book was on 4 cuneiform tablets written in Akkadian. And I went to the Sterling Library at Yale, and they let me hold the tablets. And they were smooth. I couldn't believe they let me do that, but they did. And these tablets really, they had 44 recipes on them. And the recipes were for the gods. So I realized this was all to get to a book. You realize this is how I work. And somebody just called me and said, now be very coherent. I'm not so coherent, but that's the way I am. Anyway, so what was really helpful to me in the work that I was doing was to seeing what were the ingredients that were used. These were huge amounts of food for the gods, and of course then for the rest of us. And these were like 10 oxen, and they were stews of meat and vegetables. But some of the things that they were eating were things like nigella seeds, which you see in the cover of this book, that we're discovering now. They had beets. They had a borscht, believe it or not. A beet soup is one of the recipes. They had flatbreads. They had chickpeas. They had sesame seeds, which meant, since sesames came from China and was the first seed oil, that people were coming from China and going as far away as Cyprus. And the reason we know that is that on boats at that time, because they found china in Cyprus that looked the same as china that they found in the same period in China, the patterns on the china. So what I realized was that these were the waterways, the highways of commerce at 1700 BC. And later, after I wrote this book, I discovered, and I'm going to go visit it this summer, that in northern Galilee, there was the most ancient wine cellar of the Middle East. And that was from 1700 BC too. And so that meant that there must be other archaeological sites that we don't know about with food from that early period. And I also know, I have seen things a little bit later, like in where the Essenes were in Qumran. I saw like a date honey press. And then, of course, but wine was really important. And so I learned about these things. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is 1700 BC. There were no monotheism then. But there was this guy named Abraham who lived about 300 miles south of Babylon, where they discovered this cuneiform tablet, the tablets. And he, of course, he broke his father's idols, and he was a monotheist. And so I think of him as one of the first hippies, because he brought his commune, and they all went to the Holy Land, to the land of Canaan, where they discovered other things that you all know, like pomegranates and dates. And I'm convinced they were probably in Iraq at that time or in Mesopotamia, but they saw that we know from Deuteronomy that they had pomegranate, dates, olives, grapes, wheat, barley, and one other, figs, I guess. That was, but they also had chickpeas. And they also, because they discovered chickpeas from 12,000 years ago, just recently in Jordan. So they did not have hummus in this book. However, I think they did have hummus. I think that hummus was the food of the poor people, and it was protein. And they probably did not have lemon in it because it was too early, but they definitely would have had a gruel of chickpeas and sesame oil because they had sesame. And I think in the Bible where Boaz, who was a farmer, was feeding his people and his workers, and he gave them bread, probably like pita bread, dipping it, and it's in the Bible it says in vinegar. It's a mistake. It should have been in like a hummus or in chickpeas because it was a very similar word in ancient Hebrew. And as somebody said to me, if Boaz was giving his workers vinegar, dipping his bread in vinegar, how could they work? They needed some sort of protein. And, when you go, I'm sure lots of you have been to Jerusalem or other places in the Middle East, and you go to these places and you realize that nothing has changed. People in the morning have hummus. If you go in the old city especially, and at night they have hummus. It's something that fills the stomach. Anyway, so I started looking at food like this and becoming very, very interested in it. And then I realized, okay, so this was, Abraham was about 1400 BC. Solomon was about 1000 BC. And he his temple, he was the first person who sent people out from around the world to find peacocks and jewels and spices for the temple in Jerusalem. And he took the 12 tribes and he tithed them to go to, for each one of the tribes to go have a month to get food to bring back, food and other things to bring back to the temple. And so that's what got me interested in King Solomon. And of course, the number of women he had didn't hurt either, because I thought they all brought foods and spices from their part of the world. And I'm sure, he had big appetites, so he probably also liked to eat. So who knows? Anyway, it's a metaphor, and it's a good metaphor. My publisher is very pleased because it's sold in the last 3 weeks about almost 25,000 books, which is really amazing. So I'm very happy too. The reception I never thought that there would be a reception like this. So basically what I did was I took this image of King Solomon, but I looked at food all over the diaspora. Of course, I spent a lot of time in Israel. It depended on where I went. I went to places like Georgia, Russia, or Argentina. And what I did was I looked at the New World, the Old World, how foods crisscross the ocean, and I started really concentrating most of all on the Jews of Iraq, because I think that the Jews of Iraq were the first ones. First of all, Babylonia was the center of the world until about the 8th century. And when Jews went first for the destruction of the first temple, they went to Babylonia. A lot of them stayed there because it was cosmopolitan. It was like people coming to New York from Israel. They liked New York. Some, of course, go back to Israel, but a lot of them stay. And I think it was the same thing. It was the center of the world. It was center of culture, center of food. And there are a lot of dishes that I saw from what I've been studying for years and years. For example, cholent, which is an overnight stew, right? But what they have in Iraq was a little different, or in Mesopotamia, it was a tabit. And a tabit is a chicken with rice and chicken skin. It was actually, I wanted to learn to make it. It was the overnight stew, but I knew that they used chickens earlier than they did in Jerusalem. And also people ate chickens. Most of the time when people ate chickens in the ancient world, it was chickens that had finally stopped laying eggs. You really had chickens from eggs, or cocks after they stopped fighting. So those were the two things. And of course, Judaism didn't really allow cockfighting However, others did. And so, when we think about it, how many times do you want a kosher hen for chicken soup? And that was, But anyway, so I wanted to learn to make this dish called tabit. And tabit really means oven. So I live in Washington, and I met a man named, I think, Meyer Souffert. And he lived in Virginia, and he said to me, I know how to make it the old-fashioned way. And I'd seen a lot of shortcut tabit recipes throughout my career. So I went to his house, and I brought the Israeli ambassador's wife with me. And I said, she wanted to go to Tyson's Corner to go shopping. And I said, I'll tell you what, we'll take a detour and go to this guy's house and just learn how to make it, and then we'll go shopping. Well, needless to say, we never got to shopping. As soon as we walked in the door, and she was, she had high heels on and everything, this guy gave her a needle and thread and said, do you know how to sew? And she said yes. And then he had already skinned the chicken. He said, here's some chicken skin. And by the way, I watched an Ethiopian make chicken for Shabbat, and he did it pretty much the same way. So she put the rice in the skin, and she sewed it all up, and she kept giving me these dirty looks, and we were several pockets, and then many hours later we left without even tasting the chicken because it had to cook overnight. But the thing is, it was a really interesting event. But I remembered that night he said to me, listen, if you really want to learn about Iraqi cooking, go to London. So the best Iraqi cooks are in London. So I always, put that in the back of my mind. And when I started researching for this book, I went to London to interview Otto Lengi because I thought he was a really important character in food. And I also wanted to see the Geniza, which I'm sure most of you know about, there was this wonderful book called Sacred Trash. If you've not read it, read it. These were the stashes of holy ephemera that were from the 8th century to the 13th century, and they were supposedly in churches and in mosques and in synagogues, but they found a huge stash of them written on sheepskin and parchment in a Cairo synagogue. So they found them at the end of the 19th century, and most of them, I think there are a lot in Philadelphia, but there's a lot in Cairo. So I went to the archives and I learned what foods were there, and you'll see in the book, like this one guy, he writes about how he doesn't like his wife and she's not a good cook. Anyway, and then he has his shopping lists for Shabbat. And I realized that shopping lists for Shabbat is as much as we get for recipes, because first of all, the women did not always write, and the men would buy food like when they got paid, and they still do it in Jerusalem, Wednesday or Thursday, they would go to a market, but they needed to have something written down because they wouldn't remember it all in their head, and actually that's how writing got started. So they would go to the marketplace, and I could see what, they'd have like a chicken for Shabbat, and this was the one in later, but also very early. So I pulled together, I don't know if you saw the article I did in the Times on chicken. There was an excerpt of this book in the Times just before Passover, and I had a chicken with eggplant and lots of different spices, and that was from what I saw from the Geniza. But then I went through all of my cookbooks. I have a very, very big collection, looking, because I never made chicken with eggplant as a main dish. I don't know why I didn't. But then I saw all these recipes throughout history, starting in my Iraqi cookbooks of this dish. And I realized what they did was it went from chicken and eggplant to Spain, where so many of them went, and then it went out to the Sephardic diaspora. And so that went to Greece, it went to Morocco, and of course Jews used eggplant much earlier than anybody else used it. Anyway, so that was how it did it. And let me just tell you that one of the great things about writing this book was having an opportunity to go to people's houses. I mean, not just writing this book, all my books. But I'll just give you an example of something that is in the book, and these are like priceless things that you don't get them on the phone, you don't get them through the internet, you get them when you see people and you're with them face to face. This was about Tabit. I met this woman. Her name was Eileen Dangor Kalachi, and I'll just read you a little bit from my book. On a recent trip to London, I visited Eileen Dangor Kalachi, one of those naturally good cooks who lives in an apartment overlooking Baker Street. Eileen, now in her late 80s, may have left Baghdad in 1975, but the family dishes, decorated with rosebuds and fragrant with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, and turmeric, remain in her thoughts and perfume her kitchen. During a delightful day, I learned recipes and listened to stories about Eileen's early life, when some 20 people, mostly family, when family meant everything, lived in a big house overlooking the Tigris River. At home, we used the rice my husband's family grew, Eileen told me in her kitchen. The rice often had small stones in it, so we had to clean it before we washed it. Then we washed it again and again. The rice we get today is clean, but we Iraqis still wash it 3 times and soak it for a few hours. In Baghdad, we only ate fruits and vegetables in season, so we had to make and store what we needed for the whole year. We even made tomato puree for our cooking, she added. In the summer, everybody bought a lot of tomatoes, squeezed the juice out, sieved them to remove the seeds and the outer skin, and put the juice in a big container on the roof of the house and kept it there for a few days in the sun until it became thick. Where am I? Okay. Friday was the day to start tabit. There were no home ovens at that time in Baghdad, so the tabit was cooked on charcoal overnight for Sabbath lunch. On top of the cover, we put eggs in their shells, then covered it again, she said. On top of everything was a folded blanket to keep the heat. We ate the eggs Saturday morning with tomatoes, onions, and lemon salad, with pickles or with spring onions and parsley. Today, most cooks have learned speedier ways to make tabit than the one I described above. When I make tabit, I follow some traditional customs like using fresh spices I grind and cleaning the chicken with a lemon. Also, I make sure to produce enough hakaka, known in Iran as tagdig, the prized crust of rice that forms on the bottom of the casserole. So, there are things like that that really make, you just don't get that anymore. And then, and it wasn't just Sephardic food that I was looking for. I was looking for all kinds of food. So I found these sort of lost recipes that were really delicious. And what's happened is, since this book's been out just 3 weeks, all these people are writing me about other lost recipes. Can I find them for them? Which my assistant wrote an email to me. She said, "Ha ha, what do they think? You're the one who knows every lost recipe." But I'll just tell you about one of them, which was called Are there any of you from Toronto here? Montreal? No. Oh, I can do a Montreal one. Do you know malai? Did you ever hear of malai? Okay, well, there are two, but I'll just talk about this one. So Stritzlock was in Mimi Sheraton's book about 1,000 things you should eat before you die. And they're blueberry buns, and they're from southwest Poland. And a woman named Anna Kaplansky had a bakery in Toronto. When she came over, she was poor. That's how Jews have always started things, either through a restaurant like a deli or a bakery so that you could feed your family and you could have kosher whatever. So she had this bakery, and she remembered from Poland the fresh blueberries in the summer, and they had the same things in Toronto. So she made this pocket pastry that was oblong, where she put her blueberries in, and she enclosed it, and then she put a sugar sauce on top and baked it. And I tried the recipe. It was all right. It wasn't great. And then I called Mitchell Davis, who's the vice president of the James Beard Foundation, and I asked him, he's from Toronto, did he ever eat these blueberry buns? And he said, oh, they were horrible. And he said, they all had blueberry pie filling in them. And then I looked, when did blueberry pie filling come in? And I realized that they sold the Kaplansky Bakery, I forget what it was called, in the 50s, and whoever bought it had to make these buns because it was the iconic Jewish dish, like a bakery dish, like bagels were in Toronto. So they thought, wow, this is something modern, blueberry pie filling. So they put it in, and they didn't taste the same. So then, literally, as I was testing this recipe, a girl who stays at our house a lot, named Sarah Weiner, who does the Good Food Awards, she's from California, she came to my kitchen. Walked in the house, and I said, I'm making something, these blueberry buns called Stritzlach. She said, oh, my grandma made them. And she said, and then she tasted them, and she said, my grandmother's were better. So we remade them, and then I put a little bit more butter in them because, if you're going to have something, it just should be good. We're very careful, but so I put and then I thought I just wanted to do something with the blueberries were good, but I didn't want to add more sugar, so I put candied ginger in. So it was really good. So we both tasted them. We thought they were delicious, and they're in the book now. But what I learned for this recipe was that this one woman came from a town called Rakow in southwest Poland. Her mother came from another town 30 miles away. Both women, she was hidden during the Holocaust, she came after the Holocaust, the other came before the Holocaust. And I realized that so many recipes were lost because as soon as the Nazis came in, and I'd heard this story before. In religious communities, they knew immediately who was Jewish, and they just took them away right away. So that these were recipes, and so many traditions. It wasn't just recipes, but it just showed me that had these two women not been there then, it might have been forgotten. And of course, I'm sure in Toronto, nobody realizes that this was something brought over originally by Polish Jews. And so there are lots of hidden secrets about recipes that I've found in my book, and they're, I hope that you'll like using them, making them, tasting them, and it's just been so much fun for me to do. I'll tell you another one from I don't know how much. Where's Andy? He'll tell me how much time I have. What? 5 more minutes? Okay. All right, I'll tell. Oh, okay. What? 5 more minutes. Okay. So let me just think. I'm in Philadelphia. All right. There's another recipe called malai. And this has to do with the Columbus Exchange. It's a friend of mine in Washington invited me to her weekend house on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And she had this tattered piece of paper, and she said, this is a recipe from my mother. And I've known her for 40 years. She said, I wanted you to try this recipe. And it's cornmeal and flour and butter and ricotta cheese and eggs. And it's like a pudding, but a breakfast pudding. It's a little bit like, for any of you that have my Jewish Cooking in America, I think it's called the Alaska Blintz something or other. Anyway, it's like Blintz's, but a little bit differently. So I thought, well, I'd never heard of malai, but malai, of course, means corn in Romanian. And her family came over, as so many of the Jews did, after the Kishinev riots in about 1904, and they came to Montreal. So I did a little bit of work, and I realized, well, wait a second. When the Romans came from northern Italy, where they planted barley and other things. And barley and wheat were a gruel. That's what most people ate. And they planted the same thing in Romania, when the Danube Valley, people ate that. But as soon as corn came in, and many of the people that brought the corn to the old world from the new world were Jewish spice merchants who had left Spain, many of them with Christopher Columbus, or stowaways on the ships. I mean, there's no, the fact that Christopher Columbus, this first ship was exactly the date of the deadline that Jews had to be out of Spain is no coincidence. The ships were rented by Jews that were trying to get out. So a lot, and it was safer for the owners to let those rentals go back and forth than to go to the New World where they didn't know what they were if they'd ever come back. So, but there were stowaways on Columbus's ships, and a lot of these were Sephardic Jews who stayed and learned about all these new ingredients and came back with them. So corn was one of them. By the way, corn, Jerusalem artichokes, potatoes, I think those were the three. I'll think of something else later. But those were all used as fodder. Nobody ate them when they first came over. It was all for animals. And then they started to use them for people. So what happened was corn was able to be planted in Romania, and it tasted a lot better than barley did as a gruel. And so people replaced the barley in these dishes, and Mama Liga is one example. I mean, it had a similar climate to northern Italy. So I realized that's how the corn got into the diet of the Jews, because can I have like 5 more minutes? Okay. So as far as I'm concerned, there are 3 things that show what is Jewish food, or define Jewish food. One, of course, are the dietary laws, right? The second is this mercantile interest, starting with people like King Solomon, where they went out looking for the new. And also, Jews are obsessed about food. So they would go out looking for the new forever and ever. And then the third was Jews were kicked out of countries. And so they had to adapt to other cuisines. So in Romania, as soon as there were Jews there and they had this corn rather than the barley that wasn't as tasty, they started, and other people were adapting it. Jews followed suit. You didn't have the internet then, but you did have marketplaces, and you could see what other people were doing, and people talked. Anyway, so that's what happened. But then I realized there's another component to this. Why was it just why don't we have it in this country, this malai? And I have this group on the internet called, Facebook, it's called Jewish Cooking. And in this group, people ask questions about things like, I asked about what's malai, and I got all these answers from all over, that it is a corn pudding. So I did a little Canadian history, and I realized that there was a man named Clifford Sifton, who was a minister of the Interior, and he wanted to inhabit Saskatchewan. So he encouraged people to come from the Ukraine, from Monrovia, from Romania, just about the time of the Kishinev pogroms. But what he didn't want to come in were either blacks or Jews. But he didn't know who was Jewish that was coming in through Montreal to go to Saskatchewan. And my guess is lots of people had their own relatives, and so they stayed, like my friends' relatives. And so that's how this malai became such a specialty of Montreal. So my book is full of great stories and great recipes, I think, and you can ask me any question you want. Thank you.
Tomatoes were also imported from the New World.
The what?
Tomatoes were also
right, of course. Tomatoes, and can I tell you a great story about the tomatoes? There was a man in Williamsburg named Dr. John Sickery, And he was the only Jew in Williamsburg, Virginia. And he was a Portuguese Jew. And he was supposedly, I mean, it's written in Winter Tour. There's a photograph of him, and it's written on the back of it saying that he was the one who introduced tomatoes to Virginia. People were afraid of tomatoes. They thought they were a member of the nightshade family. They thought they were poisonous. Even my mother-in-law, who grew up in Poland, wouldn't eat tomatoes when she first came to this country after the war. And if you read a lot of old Hebrew stories, they were afraid of tomatoes. So and this is, I think, probably an apocryphal story, but Thomas Jefferson was it was in Petersburg, Virginia, and Dr. Sickery was with him, and he took a tomato and bit into it in the town square, and everyone went, and he didn't die. So they started eating tomatoes.
Thank you. On the personal level, how big is the kitchen in your house?
How big is the kitchen? It's pretty big, actually. I don't know how big it is, but it's a nice kitchen. I like it. If you look at, I cook in it for Tablet magazine. So, and I don't know if any of you saw Judy Woodruff's NewsHour, and we started in my kitchen. But I knew she didn't really want to cook, so we went straight to the dining room.
So everyone's grandmother has a recipe for apple cake in a Bundt pan, and it uses cooking oil, so it's parve, but what makes it Jewish?
Ah, okay. Well, what's so interesting about this Jewish apple cake, I did a little research, and I found it in so many church cookbooks in St. Mary's County, a lot around Baltimore, I'm sure around Philadelphia too, because somehow I associate both those towns together. What makes it Jewish? Vegetable oil. That's what makes it Jewish. But it was, for sure, my mother-in-law made it in Germany. I just found a Passover recipe, which is the same recipe using confectioner's sugar, cornstarch, and I forget what else. I just got it. Somebody sent it to me who went to listen to me at one of my speeches. Exactly the same recipe, but using cornstarch instead of flour. And that I think that the orange juice that's in it, when a lot of, does yours have orange juice? Yeah. That that was probably added by some orange juice company in America. But definitely, they just asked me for Lucky Peach, which is going out of business. Their last issue is going to have the Bundt Cake. And, you know, it was invented in the American Bundt Cake was invented because women of Hadassah in Minneapolis asked some company, Nordic Ware, to make a Bundt Cake, because Bundt, B-U-N-T, meant a group. So it was a group cake. But, you know, I think that it was all over. My mother-in-law was from Zamość, Poland, you know, but she never did it around. And I think that was the new thing. Every European woman that I know that came through the war that made these cakes was all a rectangular pan. I think it was more highfalutin to have something round. And also the French women make it with no orange juice and with much less sugar. So, you know, probably sugar companies too added. You know, and there were in Yiddish and English. There was a Pillsbury cook. I just saw another one, a Rumford baking. I'd never seen this before. A Rumford baking powder cookbook in Yiddish and English. I'd never seen that one before. But if you look at these recipes, you know that more sugar, more flour, because they're trying to sell it.
Lady.
Hi.
Hi.
My grandmother came from Poland and made a dish that nobody else has ever heard of.
Okay.
And it was called Schmuck. And it was a sauerkraut beef based with flanken and potatoes. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
No, but you know, if you go to my website, joannathan.com, I think I can find it, actually.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Joan, so I was lucky enough to also visit Kochi, and I was fascinated. It was a tour with the women chefs and restaurateurs, maybe about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But one of the main reasons I went on that tour was because it was going to go there, and because of that Jewish connection. And I wondered, on your trip, did you come across anything about the history of the spice merchants, Jewish spice merchants there?
Yeah, well, I did. When I was there, well, a few things. First of all, whenever I go on a trip, I do a little research before I go on the trip, and I get myself invited to somebody's house. And this was really hard. It was a woman named Queenie Halegua, and her father was he was the man that gave electricity to, or electrify, I guess, is it electrified? Kochi. And I met her son. I really went out of my way to meet her son, explained to him that I wasn't going to hurt her. And so we went to her home for dinner. And, the Jews were part of this, were spice merchants, always have been spice merchants, but spice merchants and other things. It was never just one thing. But there was, and a lot of them were Iraqi spice merchants. And so that's how, there was the Radenites. Have you ever heard of the Radenites? The Radenites started from Iraq. Oh, I've never talked about this in this, but they started from Iraq, and people would, let's say you lived in Iraq, then they would travel, let's say, to Aden. They had somebody that they would talk to in Aden, and they would sell spices going from place to place. In other words, nobody went the long route except for the young men that went all the way to India. They just went one length of the word, and the language they all spoke was some sort of Ladino or a Jewish or even a Hebrew. And so it went all the way to China, it went just everywhere. And they were selling all of these things. And so these spice merchants, they just found this network, and that's the same people that started looking for spices in the New World and in the Old World. So it had this huge network that did not stop. There was, and some of the families were like the Benvenisti Mendez family, and they continued. So we met Queenie Halegua. She lived in the Jewish quarter, Jewtown they call it, and what happened? She made these pastels. So her son thought, well, she must have been Sephardic originally. And I thought, she was Iraqi, but went to Spain. Her ancestors picked up the pastel, then came back to Iraq, maybe 400 years later, and then went to India. And that's what a lot of them, the Jewish roots are just unbelievable. And what I found with her and with a lot of other people, and that's why I played around with some of the recipes to make them more vibrant, because we really want more vibrant food. Even I think if you tasted that dish of your mother's that was so good, you're going to probably want to wake it up a little bit. But anyway, but not all. Some of them are really good. But Queenie she did this wonderful chicken with us, but it was sort of dark. And her pastels were Indian. They were potatoes and chickpeas and Indian spices. And I'd gone all this way, and I thought, I'm going to get great food from her, but I didn't. It was good. But then I met another woman. I went with this, I called him the rickshaw rabbi in another part of Kochi. He was a shochet, and he showed up in a rickshaw, and then he said, okay, come with me, and he found another rickshaw for us. We went to his home when he heard I was interested in food. And his wife was much younger and used a lot of bright spices. She was, in a way, much more Indian, even though Queenie Halegua liked to think she was Indian. Her stuff so she had, instead of using coriander, she'd have cilantro. In other words, she'd have fresh herbs. So I sort of played with both chicken recipes, and made a vibrant one. It was in the New York Times about 2 years ago for Passover, really good. And then a fish recipe that was in Hadassah magazine that was hers too, where I played with what I got from the other woman just to wake it up. And that's what, so much food, you really have to wake up and make it so that the next generation wants to make it. Because we know that you eat with your eyes first. And when something is beautiful, but I don't want to lose the integrity of a dish. I want it to be a real dish, but I want you to be beautiful.
Joan, did you come across anything in the Geniza, any of the lists that had what you thought might be spices, but that are now just, they're extinct, they're not available?
Oh, good question. Did I ever see any extinct, things that are now extinct? Was something in those, the cuneiform tablets, there was something called kubeb. And kubeb was a little bit like juniper berries. It was used before, it was used today for gin, but it was used instead of allspice. Now listen to this. So it was used all over the Middle East, and it was very much part of the Babylonian cuisine. As soon as allspice came from Jamaica to England and was brought to the Middle East, where it was called English pepper when I lived in Jerusalem, allspice, it wiped out kubeb because they both had like a slightly peppery, slightly allspice flavor, but it was a new spice and it was a little bit, it was just better. So you never hear about it anymore. It's almost extinct. But now, of course, young people, there's a spice shop in Washington that has kubeb, but I was told when somebody was testing one of my recipes from the New York Times, she told me that she couldn't find kubeb in New York City, but we found it in Washington. So she didn't put it in there in the recipe at all because if people can't get it. But yeah, but that was the only one that I found that was totally extinct.
As a lifelong cook, I wondered, how did you get your start with cookbook writing? What was your impetus?
Well, I started out, I was working for the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, when I was about 26 years old. And as a lark, a friend of mine and I wrote a book called The Flavor of Jerusalem about all the ethnic groups, Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Jerusalem. And Teddy, he loved the book, and it sold about 25,000 copies in this country. But it got me on my roll, knowing that food can break down barriers. And Teddy would go to a Palestinian village, and there was hostility on their side. And then he would sit down, and we had this fabulous chicken called musakhan. And he said, "Oh my God, this is delicious." And it just broke down all the barriers. They were his friends. And we went to this one village, they wanted a road, and he thought, how can we do a road? It's so far away. They got their road. And we got wonderful food. And I really learned from him the power. And it's been helpful to me with cab drivers, with everyone. I mean, when I was doing my French cookbook, I got into a cab, and you put together a proposal for a book. And for that one, I said, I want to get a French cab driver and go there for Shabbat dinner. So this guy, we were going to my friend and I were going to a kosher restaurant. And he kept saying, "Do you know this restaurant? Have you been there before?" In French, of course. And we said, "Yeah." And then finally said, "It's kasher, it's kosher." And I said, "Yeah, we know." So I said, "What, are you Jewish?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, can I come for Shabbat dinner?" But his wife must have thought I was crazy, and she said no. Too bad. But I've gotten invited a lot of places.
A few more questions?
And by the way, when you go there, you'd be surprised how many people haven't had that opportunity to see the way people eat. And not just, you learn so much more. Just like what I read to you. And that's what, then I get a real high because I think of you, my readers, who I can show them what I've learned. And these are things, I always think that my books are sort of like a point in history, where you can see, like in El Salvador, where there are 100 Jews, I went for Shabbat dinner. And what I saw, and read the book and you'll see.
I think we'll end it there then. Please join me in thanking Joan Nathan. You can ask it upstairs.